They say that some people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. We're going to learn how Yaakov Avinu shows the value of Eretz Yisrael without paying a high price. In Heintige Seder, but the Tzoltas v'shes Yaakov is gekommen ken Shem asher beretz Canaan. Our parasha describes when eventually Yaakov Avinu gets to Shem, which is in Eretz Yisrael. He purchased the place where he put up his tent for 100 ksita. What's a ksita? Stolz sich Rashi from word ksita. On his Mephorish, Rashi explains that it means ma'a, which is a measure of money, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And then Rashi continues. Rabbi Akiva says, this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin, when I went overseas, they called a ma'a ksita, that proves that a ksita is a ma'a. And then Rashi has in parentheses, and the translation in Aramaic of this word ksita is churfon, which means toivim, something which is that these coins are good, charifim, b'chol mokem, they're easy to use wherever you go. Similar to what Avram Avinu, when he paid for Hebron, used money that was over la soicher, easy to transact with. We understand why Rashi has to explain what ksita is, because we don't know what it is, and it barely appears in Tanakh. He says, it's not a common word at all. In Sefer Yehoshua, besides the end of Sefer Yehoshua. But the Pasuk has it which is really just a review of what happens in our parasha. Yaakov is given that when Yaakov bought the field of Shem, it was for Me'ah Ksita. Besides that, is nor ein mol in Sefer Eov. There's only one other time that it appears in Tanakh, and that's in the end of Eov, where his friends come to him after all of the tragedies that has happened, and they gave him a Ksita. So therefore Rashi has to translate for the 5-year-old who's learning Chumash for the first time and has not been exposed to any of these sources, as ksita made ma'a, that a ksita equals the coin called a ma'a. And I bring to the Rabbi Akiva, and he proves it from the story of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we understand that Rashi has to explain what a ksita is. What we don't understand is, sure, the term for a ma'a overseas is ksita, but there are other alternative explanations of what ksita is. Kamoi, we're going to look at two of them. Kamoi, for example, Aleph in Targum Yonis and Targum Yerushalmi, the other translations of the Torah and Aramaic say margolios, that they refer to jewels, to gems. Ksita is from the Shen Kishutim, because the word ksita is associated with the word of adornment. Why doesn't Rashi say ksita was gems? Second of all, based Ebenezer in Eov, das ksita made kivsa katana. In Eov, where the friends come to give Eov this gift of a ksita, the Ezra says the ksita is a lamb. In fact, that is how many of the commentaries explain that Unklos, who here translates, as Rashi quoted, the term ksita to mean a churfan, that also means lambs or sheep. When we find free in Parshas Vayera, Sheva Kivsos Atzayin, Sheva Kibosis is Unkles Matargim Churfon. In the Parshas Vayera, where you have the deal between Avram Avinu and Avimelech, there the word Kvasos, lambs, Unkles translates as Churfon, the same as he translates Ksita over here. So if Ksita could mean gems or sheep, what forces Rashi, who's following the Pshat, to say that Ksita means a measure of money, in a foreign language from overseas, why doesn't he use the translations that come from Eretz Yisrael, the Targum Yerushalmi, where it says that Ksita is gems? Or the Targum Yonis and Yerushalmi, or the Targum Unklis, or use the Targum Unklis, that perhaps it refers to a sheep. Why dafka ma'a? Or by frat. So the Bereshis Rabbah says, interesting, that where did we even get this idea that ksita could mean a sheep? It's from they overheard it from an Arab woman, who clearly was in the city that Chazal lived in. As ksita meant other margolis, so the keves, and she said that ksita either means gems or it means sheep. But like why do you have to go to a foreign language from people overseas when you have locals to tell you what a ksita is? That it's a sheep or it's gems. Why do you have to go to Rabbi Akiva's view that it is an overseas word for a ma'a of money? What you'll say, well, because normally when you buy things with money. So maybe that's why Rashi wanted to say that ksito is money. Well, the truth is that a couple of ways that we could dismiss that problem. It was quite normal for them in those days to barter items for items, like the halacha of people who bartered with a dog for an animal, etc. And second of all, and if it is referring to currency, throughout the Torah we give currency as shkolim. What is ksita and why does it suddenly appear over here? And certainly the Torah prefers not to use small coins, as we're about to see. Ksita or ma are small coins. Let's make it current. As a shekel hat 20 ma'a. 1 shekel equals 20 ma'a. Like the Torah tells us when it tells us what the half shekel is that you have to donate. So it says a shekel is 20 gera. Rashi says a gera and a ma'a are the same. So 1 shekel equals 20 ma'a. So then, surely the Torah, instead of saying 100 ksita, which is currency we're not familiar with, should have said 5 shkolim, which is currency we are familiar with and is used throughout Tanakh. And furthermore, the Baal as is gera kanal, seeing as ma in Torah is called gera. Then, if you want to say 100 of these coins, you should call them gera, not ma. It's a fun as ma. All of this seems to highlight that really ksita should not be ma, like Rashi said. Should be gems or sheep or something like that. Why does Rashi insist that it is ma? Now, when you think about the amount, the question is even bigger. So what makes this even more surprising? Later on, when Shem tries to seduce Dinah and he tries to convince her to marry him, so he spoke to her heart. Rashi says, what did he say that was supposed to attract her attention? He said things that would resonate with her. Look how much money your father wasted on this tiny little place called Shem, this little field in Shem. Now, if, as Rashi says, ksita are ma'a, and they 20 to 1 to the shekel, then 100 ksita is 5 shekel. 5 shekel is not a lot of money. How on earth is Shem telling Dinah, look how much money your father wasted? It's not a lot of money. It's 5 shekel. The Mokum from the Pirish Rashi in Bereshis Rabbah, the source of what Rashi is saying is from Bereshis Rabbah. Now, the Medrash Bereshis Rabbah gives many other layers of explanation for what ksita is. Which all illustrate that actually ksita was a lot of money. Whereas Rashi's insistence that it's ma, as ksita is ma, is a technique in schum gadol kanal. It's not a lot of money. If it's not a lot of money, how is Shem saying, look how much money your father wasted? This is a gadol to enter, and it would be a real stretch to try and explain this by saying, that the piece of field where he put his tent is the only piece of land that he bought for this mea ksita. He paid 5 shkolim for that. We're talking just about the dalad where he put his personal tent. That would be a really strange answer to offer. Whereas the rest of the area that he bought for the rest of his camp, which obviously was a very large camp that needed a lot of space, his family, his flocks, and for that he paid a lot more. That's a real stretch. Was ist nicht mistaver as the Pasuk soll erzählen wegen der Knie von dem Shettach Cotton, was ist given oil Yaakov. It really makes no logical sense that the Torah would have given us detail about how much he spent on the little piece of land where his tent went, und nicht einmal wegen der Knie von größten Shettach für sein ganzes Machen, and no word about the rest of the purchase for the rest of his camp. Doesn't make any sense. Und der Rebbe legt sich zu sagen, so therefore it leaves us with no other choice but to say, as not a sham ole batzit nicht, not to the male protishal Yaakov, not to kol machne shaloi. That when the Torah expressed Yaakov paying for the land of his tent, it meant his tents, which is not unusual. Even though it's his tent in the singular, we know that the Torah sometimes does that. Rashi already dealt with this issue earlier in our parasha. In the pasuk where Yaakov sends a message to Esau to say, I have an ox. What, he only had one ox? Rashi says it's normal for people to use the word ox to refer to oxen, or at least shor in Hebrew. In fact, when it comes to tents, there is precedent in the Torah that we use the singular of a tent to refer to a whole settlement. So it's really far-fetched to say the Mea Ksita is just for the piece where Yaakov's tent is. So why is Rashi insisting that the payment for Shem is Mea Ksita, just a ma'ah? Or in this case, 100 ma'ah, which means 5 shekel. Before we can answer this, there are a number of things in Rashi's Lashon which are strange. 4 things in particular. So let's look at the nuance of Rashi's language. Aleph. Rashi should have kept it much more succinct, as he normally does. Ksita equals ma. You want to know more? Look in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah. So something like that. Rashi is automatic, but instead Rashi gives us all the details. That Rabbi Akiva told us that when he went overseas, they called a ksita, they called a ma ksita. Why do I need all of that information? Number 2, is the story as it's told in the Gemara, as we have it, is that Rabbi Akiva specified that he went to Africa, not just a generic overseas country. Rashi keeps it generic that he went overseas. So you have to conclude that Rashi must have had a version of the Gemara that said he went overseas rather than he went to Africa. Because there's no way Rashi just made it up. Still have to wonder why Rashi would have used the less common girsa instead of the well-known girsa, which is that he went to Africa. Number 3, Rashi, Gimel. Rashi is matikechtem shem balamayim Rabbi Akiva. Rashi is telling us who said it, Rabbi Akiva, which is unusual for Rashi. Most of the time where Rashi quotes a Maimar Chazal, he does not say who said it. And lastly, Daled, what's interesting is there is another place where Rashi also references the language that is used in Krachei Hayom, which is also from Rabbi Akiva. Let's compare how he does it here to how he does it there in Parashas Dvarim. There he says Lashem Mekach, that Tichru means acquisition. Because overseas they call Mechira sales, they call it Kira. Even though he's quoting the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, where it also says who said it, that it was Rabbi who traveled overseas and encountered people who called Mechira Kira. And likewise, when it comes to the word Tiktofus, which we know very well, that these are words in other languages that imply to. It's also Rabbi Akiva's Maimon. It doesn't quote Rabbi Akiva. So he doesn't quote Rabbi, he doesn't quote Rabbi Akiva. Why here do we have to know that it's Rabbi Akiva who said that overseas they call a ma a ksita? Now, the very last part of Rashi, which is in parentheses, that it's translated as churfan, and churfan means very good and easy to use. There are a number of commentaries who say the reason that this is in parentheses is because this is actually not Rashi's words. In fact, if you look at early prints of Rashi, these words are not there. And so the commentaries want to say that this was added in afterwards by a student, and it was inappropriate, it didn't belong over there. Because why do you think it's mistaken? Because how could you translate the word ksita to mean churfan, which means currency that you could use in every place, where we know that Unclus uses that word as a translation for sheep. So kind of a double translation, that it means sheep and it means currency. The Parashat Vayera Kanal Sifalev. But the Rebbe is not willing to just say that this is a terrible mistake that crept in by some unscrupulous student. The very fact that the vast majority of published versions of Rashi include this parenthetical insert is mestaver to zogin, implies that this also has validity in the story, and we have to understand what that validity is. We say there. Back to Matmiyah. Furthermore, Let's just raise another question. Ummetum is unkris mtagam keves imra. Everywhere else in the Chumash, wherever unkris translates the word sheep, he translates them as imrim or imra. How come in Vayeri he calls them churfon? Was the Vater in lernen, which implies as the pshat in Tagma of Kivsus Atzayin churfon da and is nitas churfon meint kevosim. It must be that when Rashi calls them, when unkris calls them churfon, he doesn't mean that the word churfon means sheep. What he's saying is that these sheep have the quality of churfon, which is, it means that no kvasim meint on kibetargam sham und targam unkris gedarka b'chama mekaymes. So the word kvasim translates as on. Then to unkris does what he often does, which is gedarka b'chama mekaymes is moisabir behoinen, to add insight that gives us an explanation of what's going on. As is an charif and gutetzoin, that they're not just ordinary sheep; these are the best sheep. Because think about it, they're making a pact between them. Obviously, they're going to use good sheep. That's why these are sheep that are used for testimony. So the word churfon does not mean sheep. The word churfon means quality sheep. As over here, we're saying it means quality coins. And therefore, by taking the word churfon and understanding that it means high quality, it actually helps us understand the pshat of the pasuk better. But in our context, we have a question. This student who apparently added in this little piece parenthetically to the end of Rashi, what did he want to add? The Rashi is trying to tell us that a ksita equals a ma'a. What are you adding by saying and? In Aramaic, it's related to churfon, which means good coins. What does that mean? To explain all of this, let's look at this, what's going on over here, what's Yaakov trying to do, and then how does the word ksita relate to it. The hechad zu sagen as ksita mean ma is what forces Rashi to say that ksita has to mean ma'a, not gems, not sheep. Nicht von meinem Rabbi Kiva geshalach der Krache ayom chulei, das bringt Rashi nicht als al shrai na bik als isofes beer kidder come and see vav. Rashi doesn't know that ksita equals ma because of what Rabbi Akiva says in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah. That is going to help us understand it better, and we'll get there, we'll explain it. Now, from Teichen Aksuvim, what gets Rashi to understand that ksita equals ma is the content and context of the psukim. Lernen dik dem Sippel, when you learn this story, as when Yaakov is angekommen in Shrem, hat gekauft Chelkas Asad, Ashanot Sham, Oloi, tells us that Yaakov got to Shrem, and the first thing he did is he bought a piece of land. Brishon Pratim, and it doesn't tell us any real detail about what happened in that transaction, nor the boundaries of the land. So unless the Torah says otherwise, you have to assume that Yaakov Avinu paid the regular amount that is expected for that land. It was a regular contract, a regular transaction. There was no major negotiating. And the truth is to consider that he would have overpaid would go against the pshat of the pasuk. The pshat of the pasuk does not indicate anywhere that he would have paid more than what is necessary. Avram, on the other hand, Avram paid top dollar 400 of the best coins in order to get Maras Machpelah. Why? Because he needed it to be a burial place. Firstly, there's the urgency of burying Sarah and the longevity of having a burial plot. But here, Yaakov's not even looking for this land for permanence. He's on his way back home to his father, or in Hebron. Remember, when Yaakov left home originally at the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, part of his tefillah was V'shavti b'shalom, or Beis Avi, I want to be able to return in peace to my father's home. That's where he's headed. Shrem is a way station. So if he's not planning to live in Shrem, why is Yaakov buying a piece of land in Shrem? Especially when you consider he was in Shrem for all of 6 months. Why did he not buy land in Sukkos where he spent 18 months, triple as long? Yaakov's not buying the land to live in it, to settle in it. While there is gegangen Hebron, canal, because he's on his way to Hebron. Now, Blois, if I raise Tzivizens and Chvivas Eretz, the reason he's rushing to buy the land is to show how much he cherishes Eretz Yisrael. that as gleich by Mom coming in Shechem Asher Beretz Canaan, as the Torah tells us when he got to Shechem, and then the Torah emphasizes, which is in Canaan, in einem Land, was der Eibishter hat ihm zugesagt, weggehendig from Beisav, if the land that the Eibishter promised to him as he left his father's home all those years ago. I'm going to give you this land, and I'll bring you back to this land. So he cherishes this land. Immediately at the first opportunity, he buys a piece of the land. He's not even going to use it. It doesn't matter. He's showing how much he loves the land. Considering that Yaakov is not buying this land in order to live there. No, Diras Ara is just a temporary station. It's not mistaver as a Zovel and Fadem Batzon and Yosef and Zervet. This makes sense that he wouldn't pay more than what it is worth. And he certainly would not overpay. Therefore, Rashi cannot accept the suggestion brought in Targum Yonasan that Ksita is gems. Gems would be extremely valuable. Because that would then imply that Yaakov paid a fortune of money for this piece of land. 100 gems. And in all likelihood, 100 gems would be a lot more valuable than the 400 shekel kesef that Avraham Avinu paid for Maras Machpelah. For Hadiras Arai, for a temporary place that he would live, doesn't make sense. Therefore, Zaktasha, Ksita meant Ma. Therefore, Rashi says, Ksita must be a much smaller denomination, Ma. Yaakov had for the Chelkas Hasod Batzald Nor Mea Mo Chamisha Shkolim. He paid 5 shekel. Very entry-level price. In that case, you have a question in the other direction. Why do we have to know at all how much Yaakov paid for the field? All we need to know is he loved Eretz Yisrael, so he bought a piece of land. Why do I have to know how much it's worth? Let's move on. When Avraham Avinu pays a lot of money for Maras Machpelah, we understand why the Torah has to tell us that. Because the Torah wants us to know things. So that people should appreciate the value of having a burial place in Eretz Yisrael, because look how much Avraham Avinu paid for it, so we should do similarly. And based in Maile Beifin Hanagasa, also to show the caliber of Avraham Avinu's behavior. As is in Kedai given to Zolan Azar in price, that it was suitable for him to pay such a hefty amount, Arba Meir Shekel Kesef, 400 silver talents. And the most valuable version, in other words, the easiest to use as currency. Rabbi Shishler and Betachlis the Bailis from Ephron to be 100% sure that Ephron doesn't still have a toehold in this land. Or to exclude the possibility that Ephron could say, I helped you get this land, I gave you wealth, like we know Avraham Avinu did not want to have from Melech Sodom. So then, in the case of Avraham Avinu, we understand why the Torah needs us to know how much he paid. But in our scenario here, why is it relevant for us to know the price tag on Shem, that it was 100 more? We'll have to conclude. Because the Torah wants us to know that even though all he paid was 100 more, which is just 5 shekel, the fact is, it still was considered a valuable amount. To illustrate how much he loves the land, because if it's not a valuable amount, it doesn't illustrate his love. And the Father itself, the Torah wants us to know this. So how do we know that it's valuable? To be able to explain how there could be value to a nominal amount of money. Rashi quotes Rabbi Akiva, who says, that when I went overseas, they called him Ma Ksita. Vidmont Frir is the word Ksita for Lashen Kishutim. The way we got from Ksita to gems was because Ksita is associated with the idea of Kishut, of adornment. So, how does it work then that you would call a Ma, which is a very small denomination of coin, and a title that expresses adornment, doesn't seem to fit? Zetman, so we see as is doafal as a feel when the shavius from the matbeis mitzadatzmom is not gross. There are certain circumstances where even if the actual market value of something is not particularly high, when they are beginutzt als kishutim, the coins could still be used as some form of adornment. So you could use them as beads, as decorations, and therefore they could be called adornment, even if they don't have a tremendous market value. Und da sagt der Pasuk, that's what the Pasuk wants us to know. As mitzad achibas haaretz be'inei Yaakov, because of the value of Israel in Yaakov Avinu's eyes, to buy a piece of Eretz Yisrael, he uses special coins. Coins that maybe don't have to be overpaying, but they have value because you can use them as decorations. You could use them as adornments. That's why Rashi wants us to know that Rabbi Akiva learned this when he went overseas rather than when he went to Africa, because there might be an overtone with saying Africa. If in Africa they use something as an adornment, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's valuable on the global scale. We don't know much about Africa at that time. We don't know where in Africa Rabbi Akiva might have gone. So it could be that Africa was very impoverished, and the things that they consider to be adornments, nobody else would consider to be adornments, so Rashi doesn't want to go down that route. Therefore, Rashi uses the version that says, Rabbi Akiva says, overseas, they call them Moksita. Even in these big cities, centers of merchants, even there they call a mar something which is ksita, kishutin, a tachshit, a jewel. That illustrates that they have value across the board, and therefore it's a big deal that Yaakov Avinu used them as currency to buy the land of Shem. That also answers for us. Number one, Aleph, Rashi nimmt on dem Pirish as Ksita meint Keves, why Rashi cannot say that Ksita is sheep. If you barter something for sheep, you don't learn anything special about the transaction. That there's any special greatness to the transaction. So if the sheep don't give us any insight into the nature and value of the transaction, there's no point for the pasuk to tell us that the sheep can't be the ksitoi sheep. Number two, base be pshutei shel mikra, at the simplest understanding of the pasuk, where you could understand that he paid all of 5 shekel. If he could have paid 5 shekel, there's no way you could argue that the field was actually worth 100 shekel or 100 gems. You know, if you have differences of opinions, that's one thing, but to have differences of opinions at a scale of 20x, where the one person is saying it's worth 5 shekel, and the other person is saying 100 shekel, that is unlikely, and so for Rashi stays away from suggesting that it's 100 valuable coins. Gimel, we also understand now, why the pasuk does not talk in terms of shekel, or the mea gera, or even the word gera, which is the more common word that we're used to in the Torah. Now mea ksita, but the Torah emphasizes ksita because that tells us about the nature of these coins, not the value of these coins. But the hadgashi is neat of the shavius, because the Torah doesn't want to emphasize the market value of the coins. Now as Yaakov had gitzolt for the sada, but the fact that Yaakov paid and well for the field. What made it that he paid well? Not that he paid a lot of money, but he paid with something that has value to people. And lastly, Dalet, the reason why we have the parenthesis, who we're assuming is a student of Rashi, that added in the point that Unclus uses the word churfan to describe this, that they are very useful and good and acceptable in all exchange centers around the world. That only highlights further for us that the nature of the coins that Yaakov Avinu used in this transaction is that they are valuable. They are special coins, even if they're not the most valuable coins. They are special coins that have appreciation wherever you use them in the world. In fact, that's why he says not just that they are tovim and charifim, but he says, for example, like oivel hasecher, reminding us of Avraham Avinu's transaction. It's not just saying, look, you see, there are other ways that we use the expression that oivel hasecher means the same as churfan. It means something which is good for business, easy to transact with. Now, we're making a link over here between Yaakov's transaction and Avraham Avinu's transaction. What Rashi is alluding to is just like the Torah ramped up the value of Avraham Avinu's transaction to buy Hebron. Likewise, As hat gegeben Matbeas for seine Gewinn over Lasoich. And how do you know that it was a valuable transaction? Because he used the best money that he could get. Similarly, Yaakov Avinu also upgraded the nature of this transaction. How? By using coins that are not necessarily expensive coins, but useful coins that everybody wants. And lastly, what about the fact that Shem boasted to Dinah, look how much money your father wasted on this piece of land? When all Yaakov had spent was 5 shekel. The Dirk in Russian is bizbase. So Rashi is bizbase. Rashi is focusing on that concept of bizbase. What does bizbase mean? What the Badait from bizbus is nicht dafke, wenn es setzt sich wegen einer größeren Schum. Bizbus does not only mean that you're using a lot of money. Now, when das is bizbus, but rather when a person is kind of loose, so to speak, almost undisciplined in it. Even if you're paying a small amount of money, which you didn't have to pay, you're paying more than what the thing requires, is that's bizbus. That's considered waste. How's that relevant to us? As we've illustrated, Yaakov is going to be there short term, only for 6 months. Shem is looking at the story. He doesn't understand what Eretz Yisrael means to Yaakov Avinu. So he's come by him as the fact that Yaakov is not paying the price, but he's paying with coins that have value, for a smaller piece of land. This is business. For him, that's a waste. By the way, this gives us insight into something that's coming much later on in Parashas Vayira, where the Eibishter tells Moshe Rabbeinu that look at the Avos, they never questioned me. As nicht gucken, dich auf den Bries, was der Eibishter hat mit sie gemacht, lass es lem Setz Knan, Setz Mugareim Goimer, where the Eibishter tells Moshe Rabbeinu, look, I promised them Eretz Yisrael. When it was time for Avram Avinu to bury Sarah in the land, that I promised him, and now he had to pay a whole lot of money for it. And likewise, Yaakov Avinu had to pay for Shem. He didn't complain, neither of them complained, they trusted. By Yaakov, notice, Rashi doesn't say that Yaakov paid a lot of money, like he says about Avram Avinu. He doesn't even say an etc. In other words, he's not even referencing the part of the pasuk that speaks about the amount of money that he spent on it. Why? Because the fact is, Yaakov did not spend big money. It was all of 5 shekel. Now, by the sharpest students in the class is still not absolutely satisfied. Why not? After this lengthy explanation illustrating that these are unique coins, they're called kesita, they bring value. They're still money. When you consider how immensely wealthy Yaakov was, this is tuppence for him. Is b'meila moving as the ikad goshim pasuk is in the word vayikanas chelkas hasodeh. So actually, then the main part of the pasuk is not what he paid, but the fact that he paid. As Eretz Yisrael is by Yaakov given as a tire, as a gleich gekauft Chelek baretz, that Yaakov Avinu appreciated Eretz Yisrael so much. At the minute he had an opportunity, he bought a piece of Eretz Yisrael. Chod as ein dir is given in the mode from Beis Avi Chevron, even though he was going to live elsewhere in Chevron, in Eretz Yisrael. So that surely it restores the original question. The main thing is tell us that he bought in Eretz Yisrael. Why do we have to know how much he spent? So the sharp student wants to know. You're telling me he loves Eretz Yisrael, therefore he's buying a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael, even if it's temporary. Great. Why do I have to know what he spent on it? As der Fall soll the pasuk das madgish sein. How much more does it highlight his love for Eretz Yisrael that the Torah had to tell me what he spent? So the Rashi addresses that by telling us who said this. It was Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva that told the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that Rabbi Akiva behaved in a way that is beyond the requirements of the law. As given he regularly found ways to illustrate the merit of the Jewish people. Und damit es verstandig, was der Pasuk ist, Moshe Mea Kesita, that explains why the Pasuk adds these words Mea Kesita. We're talking about Rabbi Akiva, who is constantly looking for ways to speak up the value of the Jewish people. That means that Rabbi Akiva teaches us that whatever you're looking at, even something which appears quite ordinary, find a way to interpret it as a schus for the Jewish people. Therefore, the fact that Yaakov Avinu pays 100 ksitos is not a big, mind-blowing insight. Rabbi Akiva says, but mention it, because it's another schus to add to Yaakov Avinu. Speak positively about the Jewish people, in this case, their forefather Yaakov. And that's a deeper reason why Rashi actually tells us how Rabbi Akiva got to know this information that a ma'ah is called a ksita overseas, because he went overseas. Why did he go overseas? The Gemara then Sanhedrin tells us, my chasidus for Rabbi Akiva, what's the uniqueness of Rabbi Akiva's dedication to Yiddishkeit? So Rabbi Akiva was of the view that if you have children who are born to Rishoim, Jewish children born to Rishoim, they have a chelik in Olam Haba. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Shomer Psoim Hashem, that the Eibusher guards and looks after the so-called fools. What does that mean? Because overseas, the word that they use for children is pesi, the same word that is used in the pasuk of here, that the Eibusher protects them. So the deeper meaning over here is, as the Chassidus from Rabbi Akiva is neat nor in the Klodus Inyan. That means that the uniqueness of Rabbi Akiva is he's going beyond the requirement of the law. It's not a generic concept. It's actually illustrated in the fact that he picks up that overseas they call children pasya. The mitzvah the Gemara Madgish, what the Gemara highlights over here is, as I feel is given Chassidus to Rabbi Akiva to Mezakeh Zaynidin. Rabbi Akiva was so incredibly dedicated to find merit for the Jewish people. As Farim given Kedait in a sin Krache Ayom, it was worth traveling overseas for this. Let me go overseas, find a place where they call children Pasio, so I could come back and give merit for the children of Rishoim that they have a chelik in Olam Haba from the pasuk Shomer Psoim Hashem. And Rashi alludes to the same thing over here in our scenario, that Rabbi Akiva traveled overseas in order to know that Ma is Ksita. It's the same journey where he heard that children are called Pasya. And that's what prompted that's what prompted Rabbi Akiva to speak positively about the Jewish people, that their children get Olam Haba. Is by the Zelbalich Ayom is gekommen noch in regular zakos. On that same journey, he found another way to find something which appears ordinary and illustrate how it's a schus, b'schusim shel Yisrael, dichaviva sa'aretz by Yaakovin, the schus of recognizing how precious Eretz Yisrael was for Yaakov Avinu. Was bei ihm ist given nicht mekem dirase, that even though as get sold for the chilkas hasode was is bei ihm given nicht mekem dirase, that he paid for this piece of land that he wasn't going to be living on long term, meyok sitom matbeis for seinen kishutim, not just coins, but coins that are beautiful to show that the land is beautiful, because that's what Rabbi Akiva wants to do, find every possible schus for the Yidden, as we should do for each other. And that will obviously bring Mashiach now.